With humanity's faces hidden safely behind masks, the widespread devastation of the Curse of Faces was finally quelled. After hundreds of years of death and isolation, the kingdoms of the world were finally rebuilt, and a semblance of the world from before the advent of the curse finally returned. That's not to say everything returned the same, though. The kingdom of Haravel, once a proud nation that spanned most of the continent, now only covered a fraction of the land it once controlled, and to its east, a new empire was formed. Built on the worship of the Maker, the man who discovered that masks could save humanity from the power of the curse, the empire of Oriun quickly rose as the next great nation in the wake of the curse. Within only a few generations, Oriun would become the most powerful empire the world has ever seen. Still, despite the vastness of Oriun's army and the swiftness with which it conquered its neighbors, it was no match for the power of the curse, and it would be many years before the truth would be uncovered through the events of Verho, Curse of Faces. In our last Behind the Mask video, the Oriun Empire and the Haravelian Kingdom had agreed to a peace treaty, avoiding the violence Oriun had become known for with its aggressive expansion in the decades before. Through this treaty, Haravel was able to remain independent and unconquered, while Oriun avoided devastating losses to their forces that would have hindered their expansion to other parts of the continent. Coincidentally, it was also around this time that scholars discovered that the Curse of Faces had originated in the Old Kingdom of Yariv, the entrance to which was only accessible through Haravel. This newly found peace allowed an expedition from Oriun to pass through Haravelian land unchallenged, even recruiting some Haravelian people to join them as they ventured to the mouth of Yariv and eventually inside the mysterious kingdom. Meanwhile, with their newfound allies to the west preoccupied with the expedition into Yariv, Oriun set its sights eastward, eyeing the unexplored region there as its next conquest. They also began mustering forces to march south to the newly formed kingdom of Moigur, where many years ago, people from Oriun that disagreed with the religious crusade of the empire fled to escape persecution. Word had reached the Oriun capital that the defectors to the south were not only surviving the harsh desert climate, but had allied with the native giant snakes that lived there, and were establishing a powerful and potentially problematic kingdom in the south. With little more than that information to guide their decision and their historically different beliefs, Orion's leaders ordered forces to be stationed along the Morgarian border as a show of strength and to discourage any thought of rebellion against the empire. Moigur, however, had no intention of rebellion whatsoever. The desert nation of the south, while not without its own history of conflicts in its founding, was not an inherently violent nation, instead focusing on expanding their knowledge and understanding of the world rather than its borders. This did not mean that they were unprepared, though. With the humans of Moigur's knowledge of Orion's strength and tactics, paired with the legendary craftsmanship of the giant snakes, Moigur fortified its borders with advanced weaponry and defenses, quickly establishing a no-man's land with their superior range and accuracy. Unable to advance their forces any further to the south without being met with a rain of bolts from the Morgarian crossbows and ballistas, Oriun abandoned any hope of crossing into Moigarian territory, instead opting to establish a permanent military installation along the southern border and reciprocating the silent hostility of Moigur's army. This relatively uneventful conflict continues to this day, the unspoken understanding that neither army will cross the border into the other, keeping an uneasy peace between the two nations. The kingdom to the east of Oriun, however, was not so prepared. The Empire's crusade saw its forces spread quickly into the neighboring nation of Wardun with relative ease, driving the inhabitants of this quiet and peaceful kingdom away from the borders and towards their nation's capital. Wardun, which, even before the spread of the Curse of Faces, kept to themselves and preferred to avoid interacting with other nations, had little military experience and a practically non-existent army to defend themselves. That's not to say that they were completely helpless, however. Wardun simply chose to build their culture around healing the world and desired only to help humanity return from the devastation of the curse's effects. Using their knowledge of blood magic, a uniquely powerful school of the arcane, Wardun was a nation of healers and compassion. So when faced with invasion by the Oriun Empire, many of Wardun's people didn't even understand what was happening. Wardun's leaders, however, were not so ignorant. Well versed in the true extent of blood magic's power, they gathered the most powerful mages in the kingdom to Wardun's capital, amassing a small but powerful force to stand against the invading Oriun Empire. Having met little resistance during their crusade, Orion's army was unprepared for what was to come when Wardun eventually retaliated. Though their numbers paled in comparison to the sheer size of the invading Oriun forces, the mages of Wardun's powers were unlike anything Oriun had faced before. Not only could they heal those that fell in battle, but they could also inflict a crippling amount of damage on Orion's ranks, bringing their invaders' progress grinding to a halt. Though suffering heavy casualties, Orion's great army was vast and resolute, regrouping quickly and adjusting their tactics to push their lines forward with brute force and sheer numbers. Powerful as they were, Wardun's mages were eventually forced back by their overwhelming adversary, unable to collect themselves for long enough to recuperate before another wave of Oriun troops would advance. Seeing the futility of their defenses against the seemingly endless sea of enemies, and owing in part to their historically passive nature, Wardun eventually offered their conditional surrender to the Oriun Empire. In exchange for allowing those who had committed themselves to the School of Blood Magic to remain an independent nation on a small island off the coast of Wardun's eastern shores, Oriun would be given control of Wardun's mainland region. Considering the massive casualty rate of Orion's own army, the Empire agreed, allowing the people of Wardun to choose whether they would remain on the mainland or stay true to their native culture and retreat to the island that would eventually become known as Old Wardun. With the last of the Great Wars finally coming to an end, the continent and humanity settled into a relative stability, with only minor conflicts arising periodically between independent factions of each nation, unaligned with any kingdom's leaders or armies. Aside from these occasional nuisances, the continent began to turn its attention in earnest to the looming presence of the Curse of Faces. For even though there may have finally come a time of peace, humanity was still forced to cower behind their masks or risk an instant demise. Those who had ventured into Yariv on the joint expedition from Oriun and Haravel had still not returned. Though it was known that Yariv was the source of the curse, it was still not understood how or why the curse happened. Many who remained outside of Yariv deemed the expedition a failure and resigned themselves to a life behind a mask, labeling any who would even consider sending in another group or venturing in alone as fools with a death wish. Still, the indomitable spirit of humanity lived on in some hopeful individuals, and a handful of great warriors chose to pass through the mouth of the great mountain range that encircled the accursed kingdom to seek the answers humanity desperately needed and perhaps discover a cure. This brings us to the events of Verho, Curse of Faces, where, 600 years after the terrible curse was unleashed upon humanity, one warrior will enter Yariv to uncover the truth behind the devastation and hopefully save the world from its deadly fate. If you are one such warrior, be sure to add Verho Curse of Faces to your wishlist on Steam and sharpen your skills with the demo version today. You can get a head start on your adventure and carry over your progress to the full version when Verho Curse of Faces releases on November 10th. Until then, be sure to subscribe to Kobrateku Games, and I'll see you in our next journey behind the mask. Thank you all for watching.